Located some 85 kilometers from Amman, Jordan, is a small yet exceptionally well-preserved desert palace. At its prime, it would have been part of a larger castle complex, consisting of reception rooms, audience halls, and beautiful hammams. A Bedouin Arab, on his solitary journey to sell his agricultural produce in Palestine, perhaps in the year 730, may well stop at this desert oasis and make use of the well near the eastern wall. The guards may be good enough to allow him in. As he enters the main audience hall, he would be met with some remarkably unique mural paintings. Now, given Islam's prohibition of any illustrations of living beings, the depiction of a nude woman on the western side of the audience hall, or scantily clad women feeding grapes to an eastern king, would have caught him by surprise. One could not blame him for thinking that this was perhaps a Byzantine palace captured by the Muslim army. After all, iconography was a Christian tradition. The Prophet was known to have forbidden it in the strictest of terms. Yet this palace and its wonderful frescoes were commissioned by the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid II, who died in 744. Such a lifestyle would have been a far cry to that of the earliest rightly guided caliphs, who were known to have practiced a humble and ascetic lifestyle. Is it then plausible to assume that the Umayyad caliphs were perhaps only Muslim by name and not in action? Was Islam just a religion of convenience? And could the Umayyad rule be seen as truly Islamic? Much has been written about the accession to power of the Umayyad dynasty, in what may be regarded as a clear divergence in governance from that of the four rightly guided caliphs. Not since Alexander the Great had the world seen the bridging of the cultural divide between Egypt, the fertile lands of the west, and the Persian heartlands. One could be forgiven for thinking that the Umayyad caliphs were indeed God's representatives on earth. How else could a dynasty achieve such unprecedented expansion without divine intervention? Thus the Umayyads saw themselves in the most part as God-decreed leaders of the Islamic Empire, and they perpetuated this argument through theological propaganda. The letters of Al-Walid II concerning the designation of his successors give an insight into how the caliphs assumed themselves to be the chosen of God. In a letter that was sent out to his governors to be read out in a particular Friday sermon, Al-Walid II states, "So the caliphs of God followed one another, in charge of that which God had called them to inherit from his prophets, and over which he had deputed them. Nobody can dispute their right without God cutting him down, and nobody can separate from their jama'ah without God destroying him. Nor can anyone hold the government in contempt or query the decree of God." The early expansion ushered in an era of economic prosperity in the newly emerging Islamic Empire. With the unprecedented importation of agricultural goods into the Mediterranean, as well as the greater access to the new South Asia market, the Arabs enjoyed much wealth over all the social strata, and with the spread of wealth came the proliferation of knowledge. Whilst Chalcedonian Christians quarrelled on the Nicene Creed or iconography, Syriac Christians, who were doctrinally different to the Byzantium orthodoxy, had developed secular and Greek philosophical traditions. Captivated by the Syro-Greek thought, the Umayyad conquest of Syria could be assumed to have become more of a convenient assimilation of traditions rather than the spreading of the true faith. For at least 20 years of the Umayyad rule of Syro-Palestine, high functionaries and secretaries were Greek-speaking. The central administration in Damascus followed Byzantine practices, and this remained so until the reforms of Abdul Malik in 705. The frescoes of Busair Amr, in which naked dancers carry baskets of fruit for the pleasure of the Caliph, present the view that whilst the Arab had occupied the lands of Byzantium, it was indeed Byzantium that had conquered the minds of the Arab. Had the primary purpose of conquest been the spreading of the new faith, then the conquered lands of Byzantium would surely have been administratively Islamic. Much sooner, one could argue. Historian Julius Wellhausen contends that the Umayyads for the most part only accepted Islam under compulsion, embracing it at the 11th hour in the conquest of Mecca, and then had contrived to divert to themselves the fruit of its government. Islam, in other words, became a convenient tool used to manipulate the masses for the purpose of conquest, and the raison d'etre of the Banu Umayyah was to assert tribal dominance over all of its subjects. Whilst the Prophet Muhammad had talked of equality in the eyes of God, and I refer here to the hadith, that verily there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, reported in the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, it seemed to well house it at least that the Umayyad leaders had missed the memo. Now, the pre-Islamic pattern of tribal factionalism was very much a part of the Umayyad theocracy, as tribal law and genealogies became increasingly important in the post-Khulafa Rashidun period. Muayyad I, who died in 680, himself had ordered the compilation of accounts of the ancient kings of the Arabs and the non-Arabs, and this tradition continued up until Al-Walid II. Muawiyah's insistence on dynastic succession would have been a far cry to the leadership of the second Caliph Umar ibn Khattab. Umar is known to have said that whoever appoints a man because of friendship or blood ties, and for no other reason, has betrayed Allah and His Messenger. Such was the determination of the Umayyad leadership to ensure that their dynastic rule continued. The question of competence in leadership was not as pertinent. Muawiyah bin Yazid, who died in 684, was given the post at a time when he was extremely ill and passed away just 3 months into his reign. Hardly a fit and healthy leader of men. Abdul Malik was known for his hygiene issues, nicknamed unceremoniously as Abu al-Dhibban, father of the flies, due to his bad breath. And Al-Walid I was extremely poor in his grammar, often fumbling sentences from the pulpit in the Prophet's mosque. Yet this very Al-Walid had presided over the greatest conquest in Islam since the time of the second Caliph Umar ibn Khattab, perhaps a redemption of sorts. However, not all of the Umayyad Caliphs followed the line of Arab tribalism and elitism. Umar bin Abdul Aziz was one that transcended such tribal elitism. His leadership was one of integrity and justice. At times his ideals would be very much against that of the Banu Umayyah. He was poisoned by his own, as the Umayyads became increasingly frustrated at his severity towards them, and his confiscation of much of which that they had usurped. He did not appoint a successor. The convenience of Islam was, and is, its inclusivity. In order to bring about tribal cohesion and alliances, the Umayyads could rely upon the commonality in faith. However, faith alone could not redeem the open indiscretions of the Umayyad leadership. It was in this milieu of perceived transgression from God's law that the Khawarij were able to blossom. In their perception of La hukma illa lillah, no law except God's law, the Khawarij protested against the organizational structure of the Banu Umayyah, its open coalescence with Syro-Byzantine culture, and the misdeeds of the leadership in what they viewed as acts of war against God's divine will. Thus, throughout the Umayyad rule, Caliphs would have to contend with many a rebellion, small and big, from the various Kharijite affiliations. Though many a Kharijite rebellion had been quashed with ease by the authorities, the doctrines that characterized the earliest Khawarij movements, the Azariqa and the Najdiyah, left an indelible mark on the philosophical ideas that enabled the demise of the Umayyad dynasty. In that, the Islamic Empire needed to be cleansed of the unsatisfactory aspects of the Umayyad rule, and the Ummah needed to return to Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam. But it wasn't just the Khawarij that the Banu Umayyah had issues with. Julius Wellhausen states that the Shia hated the Umayyads more than the Khawarij, despite the assassination of Ali by a Kharijite in 661. While Shiites and Khawarij were diametrically opposed to each other through theology, they were reacting to the same tensions. For the Shia, God and his Prophet had decreed that the dynastic rule to follow Muhammad was to be from his Ahl al-Bayt, the Prophet's household. Though it was still early days in the formulation of Shia doctrine, the Prophet's message to the people on Ghadir Khum had not been followed, and moreover the Tashayyu had witnessed the murders and massacres of the family of the Prophet by the Umayyad leadership. None was greater than the massacre of Hussein ibn Ali and his family members on the plains of Karbala. The tragic events of 680 or 62 Hijrah are still commemorated by Shia during the month of Muharram and gave purpose to further uprisings against the Banu Umayyah. Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, who died in 687, justified his rebellion against the Umayyads as a jihad on the basis of the Book of God, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and vengeance for the family of the Prophet. As the Shia movement gained recognition for its support of the Ahlul Bayt, it grew in number due to the movement's inclusivity, the tribalist approach of the Umayyads, in which there was a clear divide between the Mawla, the master Arab, and the Mawali, the client non-Arab, bestowed an inferior status on the non-Arab Muslim converts. This dissatisfaction and demand for equality allowed many non-Arabs to identify with a theological viewpoint that focused more on divine and charismatic leadership rather than tribal elitism. And therefore Shia and Mu'tazilite thinking grew in ascendancy. The Abbasid dynasty, which I will explain in another series, in contrast to that of the Umayyads, tried to move away from Arab tribalism, forging their own political and cultural properties, irrespective of Arab tribalism. Ibn al-Faqih al-Hamadani, the 10th century Persian geographer, states that in Baghdad, opponents of Shias lived together with Shias, opponents of Mu'tazilites lived together with Mu'tazilites, and opponents of Kharijites lived together with Kharijites. Each group holds the other one in check and prevents it from setting itself up as leader. When the question of religious transgressions of the Umayyad Caliphs is discussed, no name is banded more than Yazid bin Muawiyah, who died in 683, unceremoniously brought to the throne through his father Muawiyah I. Yazid had been accused of amusing himself with hunting hounds, being in the worst of company, drinking wine to the accompaniment of music, and being of no religion. The assassinations of great personalities such as Hussein bin Ali, the grandson of the Prophet, and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the nephew of Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, are premier examples of how ruthless the Umayyad leaders were in order to assert their authority. In the case of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Yazid I had sent his commander Nu'man bin Bashir al-Ansari to Mecca in order to forewarn Ibn Zubayr. Nu'man is reported to have said, "By God, if you do not pay homage, the horsemen of Ashar will appear and pay no heed to the holiness of the place." If indeed the desecration of the Holy of the Holies was a considered option, then the Islamic legitimacy of Umayyad rule would be one of greater question. And under the Caliph Abdul Malik, this is indeed, unfortunately, what transpired. Abdul Malik, though ruthless in his authority, the assassination of Ibn Zubayr and the near total desecration of the Kaaba being examples, was by no means un-Islamic. He was known to have memorized the Quran, introduced voweling and diacritical marks to written copies of the Quran, Arabanized the ministries, invested hugely into Jerusalem, and was the founder of what is today known as the Dome of the Rock. Whilst the Caliph Umar had conquered Jerusalem, Abdul Malik had serenaded it to its Islamic glory. And whatever the motive, Muslims today revere Al-Quds and the Dome of the Rock as the third most revered sites in Islam. Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who died in 720, could be regarded as the culminating point of the Islamification of the Umayyad Caliphs. As-Suyuti regards him as the fifth of the rightly guided Caliphs and mentions that even those that envied him did not find fault in him. Now, many a story has been attributed to his greatness, whether it is giving all of his horses for waqf, charitable endowment, and keeping for himself just a grey mule, ordering precious jewels gifted to his wife to be given to the treasury instead, or even a witness seeing wolves grazing with sheep under his rule. Perhaps these stories may have created a grandiose picture than what the man actually was, or who the man actually was. but nevertheless they give us an insight into how his leadership was regarded at the time. Such examples give an insight into how the Umayyads, despite their views on tribal sovereignty, revered the new religion that they had been bestowed with. And though they may have had their misdemeanors, the Caliphs, for the most part, with the exception perhaps of Yazid I, showed more than just glimpses of their love and respect for Islam through their works. Now, hopefully, we have discussed that the Islamic nature of the Umayyad dynasty was in no way monolithic. Despite spanning just less than 100 years, each Caliph was an individual with his own ideals and perception of faith. Even the most prolific of offenders had made some remarkable strides in preserving and expanding the faith to the masses. It can therefore be asserted that the Umayyad leadership was rather saturated by way of their Islamic credentials, i.e. you cannot call them totally un-Islamic and you cannot call them totally Islamic. It cannot be ignored that the military accomplishments of the Banu Umayyah created an environment for societal advancement under the banner of Islam. Damascus became the center of Islamic knowledge for centuries to come. Samarkand and Bukhara likewise became Islamic nurseries of knowledge, attracting people from far and wide across the Silk Route, and the Iberian Peninsula set the tone for scientific advancement across Europe, inspiring the European Renaissance. Thousands of minarets scattered across southwestern Europe, North Africa, Western and Central Asia, and of course the Middle East, calling out 5 daily prayers, are testament to the Islamic legacy of the Umayyads. Much of what we have today by way of Islamic knowledge is the legacy of the Umayyads, from the earliest works on Arabic grammar derived from the principles as set out by the Holy Quran, to the preservation of Hadith tradition. In the reign of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, a concerted institutional effort was put in to collate and preserve the Hadith of the Prophet. Upon the instruction of his Khalif, Abu Bakr ibn Mohammed ibn Hazm, who died in 737, took on the task of collating and writing the Hadith in an institutionalized effort like never been done before. Umar bin Abdul Aziz is reported to have written to Ibn Hazm stating, "Seek out whatever there is of Hadith of God's Messenger, or Sunnah, or Hadith of Amrah, and put them in writing. I am alarmed by the demise of knowledge and the disappearance of scholars." T.S. Anderson describes it best by mentioning that by slandering the Umayyads in their entirety, we introduce a gap in Hadith transmission. It calls the whole issue of Islamic governance into question. If the 2 best generations that ever ruled the earth were ruled entirely by evil men, then what hope is there for the rest of us? The Umayyad dynasty eventually fell in 750, after years of fighting rebellion and revolt. A dynasty that had accomplished more than no other in the history of mankind within such a short space of time, just 89 years, was replaced by the Abbasids. One can perhaps posit that given more time, the dynasty may well have left its tribal elitism and factionless ideologies. That was certainly the route they seemed to be going down. The ethnically and religiously inclusivist policies of the Umayyads in Andalusia being prime examples. Now, if this would have been the case, would historiographers have been much more embracing and much kinder about the claims of the Umayyad dynasty being Islamic? I think that may well be conceivable. Thank you for listening, and this essay is also available free of charge online.